Good afternoon. I have a lot to present, so I'm going to go ahead and ask you to come on in. If there's anybody out in the hall, come on in and join us. Like I said, there's a lot to present. My name is Chelsea Strickland. I am the state monitoring lead. I had to stop and think about what my title is right now. The state monitoring lead for the Florida Department of Education, and I work for the Bureau of Exceptional Student Education under the leadership of Vicki Katanis, she's our chief, and then Dr. Aaron Sampson, who's our deputy chief. I have the honor and privilege of presenting today about access points, which are now not only called access points, but alternate academic achievement standards. And these are our objectives. We're going to go over the FDOE goals. We're going to talk about the value alignments real quick. I want to make sure you're familiar with those. And then we have some terms to know. And we're going to talk about eligibility. Obviously, you can see we have a lot to do. And then we're going to end up with the implications of learning via alternate academic achievement standards. Okay. So our number one goal at the department is to have learning gains at all levels for all learners. And we want that to be a seamless articulation and make that progression for readiness at every level. And we want to do that in order to build a skilled workforce, and we can measure that through employment and learnings, and we want to act efficiently on that and have evidence of return on investment. Return on investment is data. Data telling us how we're doing with that. Data is one of those, it's objective numbers. They're one of my favorite things to look at. Okay, here's the 2020-2025 value alignment from the Florida Department of Education. I love, love, love that at the very top it says all children can learn, and I believe that. Obviously, we do too. We also value student and family-centered learning, closing achievement gaps, and doing that with urgency. Forensically supported ROI, that's that return on investment. So I love using the words forensic, okay? I'm a CSI geek, so forensic, that's that data piece. And then measure what matters. So we really want to hone in on how are we doing in specific areas. And how are we going to do that? How are we going to accomplish these values? Well, we're going to do that, but we're going to elevate and celebrate our teachers. We're going to keep people accountable, our schools, our districts accountable for all students. And we're going to continue that competitive drive. And I love that our governor was here last night, and he's always pushing us. You know, we look at Florida and then we look at Pennsylvania. We look at Florida, then we look at Ohio. We like to do that. But ultimately, we want to reach the moral high ground of aspirational goals for our lifelong learners. Isn't that great? Like, that motivates me. Okay, so terms to know. So the following terms that we're going to talk about are things that I want to just kind of freshen in your mind. You probably have seen these, but I get cobwebs sometimes, especially with COVID, and I need to refresh. Okay, what does that mean? Where is that written? So the first one is MTSS, and MTSS is a multi-tier system of support that all students are in all the time. We all start out on Tier 1. And Tier 1 should be that really robust instructional curriculum that we're implementing not only in academics, but also in behavior. As our students have more needs, we up supports to target more specific areas. And if beyond that, keeping Tier 1 and Tier 2 in place, if they still need supports, then we go into individualized targeted supports. So Tier 1 stays, Tier 2 stays, and Tier 3 stays as well. Now, you see the little circle? You'll see me this is where I hold my little circle right here. I'll try not to hit the mic again. But that's the problem-solving circle. And in the problem-solving circle, we define the problem, we analyze what's going on, and we create a plan to implement. And after we implement, during the implementation, we then review and evaluate how we're doing. Remember we talked about forensically supported return on investment? That goes back to that data piece, okay? So, MTSS and problem solving, two of my favorite things to do. All right, supplementary aids and services. Before I go forward, you'll have to bear with me. I'm supposed to stay away from that thing. You have to bear with me. Before I go forward, the next few terms that we're going to talk about are reminding terms. Like you've probably heard them, and okay. So the big thing that I want you to remember is we need to make sure if our IEP team determines that our students, our children, need a specific accommodation, supplementary aid and services, what have you, that it's documented in the IEP, okay? So, does anybody remember the Ragu commercial that said, it's in there? Yes, you said it. Okay, so, we're gonna do this. We're gonna make this interactive, okay? As interactive as I can get it. So if I say, like Ragu, you're going to say, it's in there. Oh, yes. Can we do it again? Like Ragu. All right, one more time. Let's try it. Like Ragu. Perfect. Okay. That makes me so excited. You don't know how I stood in that hotel room, and I'm like, do I do it or not? It was either I had to change the shoe. Anyway, all right, great. All right, supplementary aids and services. Supplementary aids and services are the services and means of the aids and services that we support our students with so that they can stay in those classrooms with students with disabilities can stay in classrooms and learn with students that don't have disabilities. As much as possible. We want that. There's so much research, there's so much data about how well students with disabilities do when they're with their peers that don't have disabilities. That's exciting to me too. But, here we go. In the event that the IEP team determines that our child, we're all going to have a child together, okay? Just saying. That our child needs supplementary aids and services, we're going to make sure it's like Ragu. Yes! Whoa, that makes me so excited. Do you hear it, Chief? See, I still got the teaching. Sorry, y'all. Okay, our next term is accommodations. When we hear accommodations, we need to think access. How is our child accessing the information? I know, like, I'm really nervous, but I'm really excited, and you're smiling. It makes me so happy. So thanks, I needed that. Okay, so accommodations, access, meaning accessibility. Okay, accommodations are changes that are made in how the student assesses information and demonstrates performance. So how they get the information and how they show what they know. Now, accommodations can be provided in 4 areas. Presentation, how our child receives the information. Responding, how our child shows what they know. Setting, how the environment is made accessible for the instruction and assessment. And then scheduling, how are the time demands on that student's schedule adjusted. Now, if the IEP team determines that our child needs accommodation, we're going to be like Ragu and yeah, we're going to make sure it's in there. We're going to make sure it's documented in the IEP. Let's look at these two side by side. Supplementary aids and services, that's those pieces that are put in place for our students to stay and be educated with students that don't have a disability. And then our accommodation, and there's the difference. Either way, if the IEP team determines that our students need supplementary aids and services or accommodations, we're going to make sure it's like Ragu. Yes, it's documented in the IEP. Here are some examples of supplementary aids and services and accommodations. These are very specific, and we need to make sure that if the IEP team determines that our student needs these things, we're like Ragu, thank you. Okay. Whew. All right. If you get tired of it, just keep doing it for my sake, please. My mental health is at stake here. All right, modifications. Modifications are changes into what is expected of the student. So expected of the student to learn and may include changes to content, requirements, and expected level of mastery. So when you think of modifications, you need to think change in complexity. What do we think? Modifications, change in complexity. Okay? Modifications, change in complexity. And that's really my brain. That's what I have to do. So, okay. Changes that modify the requirements of the standard and lower the expectations. And lowering of expectation can limit academic progress of the student. The following are examples of changes that modify the requirements of the standards, requiring a student to do fewer objectives, reducing the level of complexity on assignments and assessments, using accessibility support that invalidates the intended construct or standard. So I'm not going to allow the student to use a spell checker on a spelling test. In the state of Florida, as per the Student Performance Standards, Rule 6A-1.09401, the access points or alternate academic achievement standards adopted by the State Board of Education shall serve as the basis of the Florida Standards alternate assessment based on alternate academic achievement standards. Whew. What does that mean, Chelsea? Okay, what this means is the only modifications that are approved and adopted by the State Board of Education are access points. And those access points are adopted in that rule, okay? Again, the modifications that are adopted are called access points in the state of Florida, and they're written in that rule. We can't just willy-nilly and say, oh, we're going to do this. No. There is a Florida Standards alternate assessment that has access points in it that are assessed, and those assessed access points are written in that rule. Okay, I love to compare things. Accommodations versus modifications. Accommodations is the change in the access or how something is accessed. Modification is that change in complexity. For the sake of color, we know that. But I want to look down here real quick. Accommodations don't go away when modifications are put in place. All right, and it's really important that they stay there, because we want to know what does it take for our student to progress and learn. And so all those pieces, that oral presentation of question and answer choices, frequent breaks, all that stuff needs to be in there, because that teacher, when she picks it up the next year, she needs to know exactly how that engine of baby, it's back there on the very last row. Sir, hey. It's back there. Is it your shirt? Yes. Yeah, I put it back there on that back row. It's last chair. I was hoping somebody would come find that shirt. But accommodations, they need, here we go. So if the IEP team determines that our child needs accommodations and modification, we make sure, like Ragu, all right, here we go. And then I wanted to make sure that all of these were side by side. Now, with supplementary aids and services, access points and the learning of access points can be embedded into that general education classroom. There's lots of data about how inclusive classrooms are so successful, and how students thrive whenever they're learning with their non-disabled peers. So I want to make sure that you know that because a student is learning or being instructed with access points, that does not mean that they have to be pushed out. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more, because that's one of my favorite subjects. All right, access points. Modifications in the state of Florida are called access points. And this is our true definition. Alternate academic achievement standards built to target the salient content, the most important content of the Florida standards. They're designed to frame the instruction and assessment of students with the most significant cognitive disabilities, allowing them to work towards the general education curriculum. Our access points align with our general standards. Our access points align with our general standards because access points or modification, there is a change in complexity. Everybody good? Just stop me if you need to, if I'm going too fast. Okay, here's a good visual. Standards, or I say Florida standards. Standards, and then we have two different sets. We have the Next Generational Sunshine Standards, and that's our science, social studies, art, PE, and they're leveled. And then we have our Florida Best, our Best Standards, which is Benchmarks for Excellent Student Thinking Standards, and those are just in English and math. Now, there'll be the full implementation of our Best Standards will take their piece. They're all the full implementation will take place by 22-23 school year. To support the learning of the access points, we have the tiered access points, the tiered levels, and the essential understanding. And these are just entry points for our teachers to have to support the learning for our kiddos. Okay, let's talk about eligibility. We've recently had a change in eligibility, and before Thursday, our Rule 6A-1.0943 said the following. Now remember, this is for a student to be assessed with the Florida Standards Alternate Assessment. Okay, so if you take the Florida Standards Alternate Assessment, you got to be instructed in Florida access points. And that means you have to be in an access points class or access course. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But the questions we ask to see if a student is eligible is first, do they have a disability? Do they have a cognitive disability? Do they have a significant cognitive disability? Do they have a most significant cognitive disability? Then we go to number 2. Does the student, even after all allowable instructional accommodations, assistive technology, and access or accessibility to instructional materials, do they still require modifications? Does the student require direct instruction in academic areas, the core academic areas? Do they need a teacher? And then is the student enrolled? So that goes back to making sure they're in the right course. So as of Thursday, this is what our requirements were. So the State Board of Education met on Thursday, and there was a revision to this rule. We're going to go through that. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to give you what the revision says, and then we're going to talk about questions to ask, okay? But before I do that, the Code of Federal Regulation in Section 300.320 has a statement of appropriateness. And in that, it requires that if a student cannot take the general assessment, that the reasoning is there's a statement of reasoning in the IEP. And not only that, what particular assessment will that student take? Because if the IEP team determines that a student needs an alternate assessment, we make sure, like Ragu, oh, come on, y'all. It's in there. Y'all are doing great. Y'all are doing great. Y'all are doing great. All right. So here's where the shifts start to happen. So one of the first things we really need to nail down for the U.S. Department of Education was we didn't have a definition to most significant cognitive disability. And at this point we do. And I'm going to walk myself back here because I have to turn around. Some of these are very, I want to make sure I don't get them wrong. I'll say that. So a most significant cognitive disability means that a global cognitive impairment that adversely impacts multiple areas of functioning across many settings and is a result of congenital, acquired, or traumatic brain injury or syndrome, and is excuse me, verified by either a statistically significant below average global cognitive score that falls within the first percentile, or is determined in an extraordinary circumstance when a global full-scale intelligent quotient score is unattainable. A school district determined procedure has been implemented and approved by the Florida Department of Education. So that was our definition. And then this goes into, okay, these are the requirements, and that it is an IEP team decision. So the decision that a student with a significant cognitive disability will participate in the statewide standardized alternate assessment as defined in section Florida statute must be made by the IEP team and recorded on the IEP. You as a parent are part of that team, okay? You as a parent are part of that team. So if the IEP team decides that the student will take the alternate assessment, we're going to be like Ragu and make sure. Perfect. Also, the provision with regard to parental consent for participation in the statewide standardized alternate assessment must be followed. So you want to make sure and say, yes, this is what we want, if that's what you want, okay? All right, so step one. The student must receive exceptional education services as identified through a current IEP and be enrolled in the appropriate and aligned courses using alternate achievement standards for 2 consecutive full-time equivalency periods prior to the assessment. The questions that we want to ask are, does my child have an individual education plan? And do they receive exceptional student education services? And remember, now we're in the consideration of our student or our child taking the alternate assessment, so we also need to ask, hey, is my kid enrolled in an access course? And have they been there at least 2 FTE periods? Now you might, Chelsea, what's FTE period? I had to remind myself. It's the full-time equivalency count, and that's in October and February where they say ride the bus, make sure you're at school so they can count you, okay? So two periods. This prevents schools from just saying, oh, they can't take the FSA. And it gives them plenty of time to acquire data and do their due diligence in making sure that accommodations have been put in place and we have assistive technology that we've used, all that good stuff. All right, the student must be receiving specially designed instruction which provides unique instruction and intervention supports that is determined, designed, and delivered through a team approach. That sounds so sophisticated. Like I see a team of superheroes delivering stuff to a kid. Designed and delivered through a team approach, ensuring access to core instruction through the adaptation of content, methodology, or delivery of instruction, and is exhibiting very little to no progress in the general education curriculum standards. The student must be receiving supports through a systematic, explicit, and interactive small group instruction focused on foundational skills and in addition to instruction in general education standards. So let's go back to this, and remember, Tier 1, everybody's there, okay? Everybody's there. Is my student, is my child receiving those Tier 1 supports? Is my child receiving those Tier 2 supports? In addition to the Tier 1, like they go to reading, they get a little extra, okay? Tier 3, so they get all of it, and now it's individualized to them. And all the while, that problem solving is going on. And there's conversations going on with you as the parent. Is this happening? Is my child receiving interventions in Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 of the multi-tiered system of supports? MTSS does not stop when a student is identified as being eligible to receive services. I like to say it like this. MTSS does not END at IEP, okay? It does not end. In fact, I think that the smartest of us continue forever on an MTSS because we're always trying to better ourselves. All right, even after documented evidence of exhausting all appropriate and allowable instructional accommodation, the student requires modifications to the general education curriculum standards. The question to ask, does my child require modifications after all the accommodations have been tried? And where's the data to support what was tried and how it worked? You have a right to ask that question. Don't show me the money, show me the data. You can show me the money too while you're in process. I mean, it's fine. We're here all day. All right, the next question is, even after documented evidence of accessing a variety of supplementary instructional materials, the student requires modifications to the general education curriculum standards. Does my child, do they get access to their materials? Students that have a hard time reading might not read on a certain level, but when you read to them, they might do really well. That consideration needs to be made. And if the IEP team decides and determines that that's something the student needs, we need to make sure, like ragu. Thank you. Even with documented evidence of the provision of use of assistive technology, the student requires modifications to the general education curriculum standards. Does my child have a voice? Think about that question just a minute. Does my child have a way to communicate to people what they know? If not, has my child ever had an assistive technology evaluation? Does my child use assistive technology? If so, is it used daily? That's their voice. I need my voice a lot, as you can tell. Does my child require modifications to the general education even after this evidence? We've got it in place, they're using it, but there's still maybe little to no progress, or maybe there's lots. And remember, if your child does get a piece of assistive technology, eventually they'll probably need to be reevaluated because that's their voice. They have a voice. They can tell us what they know now. It's so exciting to me. It really is. All right, even with direct instruction, so that means that teacher is right there with them. They know when they're reading them, you know. It's like a dance. I always think that way. I always could tell when my kids needed me to back up, or you need a break, or I need a break. But it requires that direct instruction. Is that happening? So I ask, is my child receiving that direct instruction? Are they exhibiting little to no progress in the general curriculum standards? Are they receiving all that instruction directly in the core subject areas? And do they need changes to the general curriculum standards? All right, so unless the student was a transfer student, the student must have been available and present for the grade level general education curriculum standards instruction for at least 70% of the school year prior to the assessment. Was my child available? Was my child in attendance at least 70% of the year to get the instruction required to build on these skills that they're about to be tested on? We want to make sure, remember in our goals, we want to make sure that we have progress at every level, and then there's articulation. I like to say matriculation because it's just a real fancy word. But matriculation, that means that seamless transition, okay? Well, you can't have a seamless transition if you weren't there to learn the information, right? Unless the student is a transfer student, we ask the question of, no, we don't ask the question yet. I'm ahead of myself. The student must have been instructed by a certified teacher for at least 80% of the school year prior to the assessment. Was my child instructed by a certified teacher for at least 80% of the school year prior to the assessment? Or were they instructed, maybe there was a situation where the teacher was there at the beginning and then she had something that happened? I would hope not, but we need to look at that data. We need to make sure we have highly qualified people taking care of our students. All right, the assessment instrument used to measure the student's global level of cognitive functioning was selected to limit the adverse impacts of already identified limitations and impairments, such as language acquisition, mode of communication, culture, hearing, vision, orthopedic functioning, hypersensitivities, and distractibilities. So, are my child's evaluation results a true reflection of their ability? A child who has a visual impairment should not be required to take an assessment that requires a lot of visual interaction. It's not a true read of what they know. Or a student that is required to listen a lot as part of the evaluation who has a hearing impairment. That does not work. So we want to make sure that when that psychologist evaluates our student, that what's selected to that instrument that's used is taking in consideration those already identified limitations. And that, remember what I said about having that voice? Once that student has that assistive technology and they're telling you and they're working with, they've had time and they've acquired a voice and they know how to use it, maybe it's time for us to reevaluate because they're getting ready to tell us what they know. All right. The student has a most significant cognitive disability as defined in paragraph 1F of this rule. Stay with me. A student is not eligible to participate in the statewide standardized alternate assessment if any of the following is true. So, I want you to think of it like this. We've gone through a lot of questions to get to this point, okay? We want to make sure that students have had the opportunity to learn on general education curriculum standards. They've had their accommodations, they've had their assistive technology, they've had direct instruction, they've been there, the teacher was there. And then we stop and think, does the student have a most significant cognitive disability? As it was defined with that first percentile. And then if we can say yes, we keep going. So if we say yes, there's 12 questions. If we say yes to all 12 of those questions, we can keep going. Now, this says if any of the following is true, they're not eligible. So the next couple questions, we have to really consider what we're asking. The student is identified as a student with a specific learning disability or as gifted. If a student is identified with a specific learning disability, they cannot have an intellectual disability. It negates one another. And it might be that the student wasn't identified as having an intellectual disability, but in saying that the student qualifies for the Florida Standards Alternate Assessment, we say that they have a most significant cognitive disability. So it's not that we're identifying them differently, it's just us saying, hey, they're qualifying for this, we need to reconsider that. So, does my student have a specific learning disability, or are they gifted? And what exceptionalities are listed on my student's IEP? So I want us to stop and think real quick. What do you think about last time you were at an IEP meeting? Think about the eligibility requirements maybe that your student had to go through, or your child had to go through. And think about, okay, does my student have a primary exceptionality and a other exceptionality? Knowing those things and keeping them in the forefront of your mind as the school year goes, and keeping tabs on accommodations that are implemented, assistive technology that's being used. That's real important. What's on the progress report? All right. The student is identified solely as a student eligible for services as a student who is deaf or hard of hearing, or has a visual impairment, a dual sensory impairment, an emotional behavioral impairment, a language impairment, a speech impairment, or an orthopedic impairment. So does my student, my child, have those things? Now hold on, okay? Do they only have these that are listed? Stop and think about that. Is that only the things that are on their IEP? Because we want to reconnect in order to see if they have a most significant cognitive disability. There has to be one of the 4 disabilities that are indicative of a significant cognitive disability, most significant cognitive disability, which is other health impairment, intellectual disabilities, traumatic brain injury, or autism. Okay, the student scored a level 2 or above. Now remember, if any of these are true, we stop, okay? Did the student score a level 2 or above on any of the previous statewide general education curriculum standardized assessments, unless there's a medical documentation that the student experienced a traumatic brain injury or they had a health-related complication after that level 2 was scored? So I'm going to ask, has my child ever scored a level 2 on the general assessment? And then I say, okay, if they did, have they had a traumatic brain injury or a complication that has caused a most significant cognitive disability since then? And then this is the last part of this is that each school, each district must submit to the Department of Education a procedure to identify students with the most significant cognitive disability when a global full-scale intelligent quotient is unattainable. In order to be approved for the use by a district, the procedure must have these elements. And we have, on our webpage, you all have access to the ESC policies and procedures for your district. And so now this plan will be part of these policies and procedures. I love when everything is in a place, and that's a place that you can go and look for all of, how are things done in my district? Okay. Oh. All right, here we go. Next, parental consent. It is so important that you all are in here today, not only for your students, for you, for those peers that you have that have students who have needs that might be looking at the, I feel like the paparazzi's over there, I kind of really am liking. Keep going, Gail, we're good. But parental consent, this is a federal thing that we, of course, reflect, and that in order to participate in the instruction of our access points or alternate academic achievement standards and participate in the Florida Standards alternate assessment, we have to have parental consent. We have to have those parents know. And the decision should be documented, not only on the parental consent form, but also on the IEP, because when the IEP team makes that decision for our child to be assessed through the Florida Standards alternate assessment, we make sure, like Ragu. Okay, I know I'm tired too right now. I just want to make sure you remember. Okay, if the parents fail to respond after reasonable efforts by the school district to obtain consent, the school district may provide instruction in the state standards, access points, or alternate achievement standards and administer the applicable alternate standards. Reasonable efforts are not just phone calls. Those are home visits, emails, documentation of all that, and let's not forget mail, like U.S. Postal Service mail, a certified letter with a self-addressed stamped envelope. They need to make that effort to get and make sure that parents know what's going on. How will the student be instructed? And more than anything, we want them to come to the party. We want them to be at that IEP meeting. We want to hear them voice those opinions and have input. Somebody's got mail. Okay. Access point examples. Okay, so we've gone through everything that's required. All right? And that parent consent, of course, well, we just want to, okay. All right, so now we're at the good stuff. What does an access point look like? Well, okay, as you can tell, there's a difference. Remember, access points are modifications, and in Florida we call them access points, so they're a change in complexity of what is required of the student. So here, you'll see that this benchmark says to conduct research, and the access point says to participate in research. Down here, conduct research to answer a question, participate in the research to answer a question. I'm not going to go through all of these, but as you can see, there is a change in complexity. And sometimes there's identified markers that the student must, they must master these in order to get to that access point. And we'll submit these. These will all be available via the app. Like this one, improve writing as needed by planning. And then it says with guidance and support from adults. And then the difference here is modeling from adults. I love that because that means that teacher's involved. All right, essential understandings. Essential understandings are prerequisite skills and knowledge leading to the mastery of access points. So I want you to envision a ladder. And these are like points that pieces that the teacher can help get those entry points for that student, get them moving towards that access points that we've made available to teachers. They provide a wide range, a variety of entry points, and they serve as, like I said, those building blocks or those rungs of the ladder. And it might be that a student doesn't need to start at here. They might have already gotten to here, but they're moving towards that access point. That access point is still what they have to show mastery in. But we're going to do what we need to do for them to climb that ladder because our goal is, from the department, that we show progress at all levels because everybody can learn. And we have included our essential understandings in materials for teachers, and this is available to the public too. Again, entry points of, okay, well, we might have this one and this one, maybe we're starting here. But ultimately, this access point is how they will be assessed, okay? It's not making it easier. We're not making it easier. We're saying these are ways that we can step in, entry points. But ultimately, this is what will be tested. Okay, access courses. Now remember, we had an alignment, right? So access courses can be found on CPOMs. underneath the exceptional student education drop down, and you pick your level. And these are those courses for the most significant the students with the most significantly cognitive disabilities, and they work through the access points. The alternate academic achievement standards. And they're aligned with the general education, just like we talked about. But the courses contain those standards, like we said, they're access points. And they're developed to support access for all students in the general education standards. Access courses are setting neutral. Just because a student is in an access course does not mean they need to be in the classroom down the hall. Okay? Access points can be in a lot of different places, including those with their same age, non-disabled, or students without disabilities in the general education courses. So, are they different, Chelsea? Well, not necessarily are they different. It's still that salient content, but it might be that there's more access points, there's more pieces that support the learning to get to that access point. Let's talk about course versus class. This is one of my favorite subjects, okay? Students are enrolled, so when you get your report card and you have Miss Strickland's ELA class or Miss Strickland's, okay, and their access courses, the student is enrolled in a course, okay? A course tells us the standards that are going to be taught and what certification or qualifications the teacher has to have in order to teach those standards, okay? So, students sit in a classroom or in a class. They're enrolled in a course. Let me say that again. Students sit in a class. They're enrolled in a course, meaning that I could have ELA for 5th grade and ELA access for 5th grade going at the same time. And oh, what a fun classroom it would be. It would be great. In fact, I did that. And this goes back to also the data that Chief Gatanis presented yesterday. So if and when you go to the app and you're looking at the presentations, she presented an immense amount of data on inclusion and how we're doing with LRE in our state and how we're including our students that have disabilities. This is the best opportunity right here for that very thing. We have data that says that the students who are learning on access points in a general education classroom do better. There are more of them scoring 3 and above. Okay, well, what does that look like? Can it happen? Yes, we already talked about this. Absolutely. Chelsea, who is learning, her IEP says that she will be learning on alternate access points, alternate academic achievement standards. She's going to be taking the Florida Standards access points. The Florida Standards alternate assessment, because her mom was like Ragu and made sure. I won't. But yes, a student that is on access points can absolutely be instructed in a general education classroom. All right. So what information needs to be included? So we need to make sure, we talk about LRE, least restrictive environment. That means the number of students, the percentage of students who do not have a disability that are in that classroom. If the IEP team recommends the students be removed from a general education classroom for a particular class, it should be evident. So, like Ragu? Correct. And if they do have to be removed, there needs to be a statement of that in the IEP as well. The this addresses the continuum of placement. How will it be implemented? Will it be in the general education classroom? Will the instruction of alternate academic achievement standards be in the general education classroom? Will it be some in the general education classroom and some in some resource room? Will it be all in a self-contained room? Will it be at a separate school or a special center school maybe? Will it be at home? Or maybe the student has medical needs and they qualify for hospital homebound? Where will it be? Because we're going to be like Ragu and make sure. Thank you. You're welcome, buddy. And so this is, I'm going to read this directly from the slide so I don't mess it up. Each local educational agency must ensure that a continuum of alternate placements is available to meet the needs of students with disabilities for special education and related services. In general, the continuum must include the alternate placement listed in the definition of special education in accordance. Did you know our state is so awesome that we have a whole rule that defines modifications, accommodations, supplementary aids and services, placement? Yes, they are in the rule. Yes, ma'am, they are. Just as it says right there, Title 34, Section 300.399. It's in there because federal code says it's in there, and we mirrored that. Okay. So what does it look like whenever you have a student that's learning on access points in the general curriculum? Well, hopefully you've got a really good system of communication between your ESE, what you will, an ESE teacher, or ESE support facilitator and that general ed teacher, or you could have a general education teacher who, so you would have the two, or you would have a teacher who's certified in both general education and ESE to implement this. But the modifications are, according to the IEP, the teacher can implement them directly in class. It might be that we're working with that assistive technology. Maybe our student goes to a resource classroom and we're working with that teacher. However, like Ragu, it better be. That's right. Okay, assessments. It's a marathon. Been waiting a month for this marathon too. Okay, so depending on what standards we're learning on, well, we're learning on the same standards. Are we learning on general standards? Or are we learning on access points or alternate academic achievement standards? Drives what course we're taking, and that drives what assessment we take. Okay, and we have TBD here because I'm really not sure if they're going to call it what the general test is going to be called now that it's the best standards, and I didn't want to put something silly in there. Okay, but if a student is learning or is being instructed in access points, they must be enrolled in an access course, and thus therefore they will be taking or participating in the administration of the Florida alternate assessment based on alternate academic achievement standards. And I say that and I keep saying that because that verbiage aligns with ESSA, and ESSA is our federal chief code. Okay, our federal law that I know it's a law, don't get me wrong, but she's helpful. I didn't want to call it the wrong thing. But ESSA is the Every Student Succeeds Act. And it tells, the verbiage is the same. So we wanted to keep that verbiage the same because if somebody picked it up from like Ohio and said, oh, well, what is this? They would see the same verbiage. We think that's important. Okay? So I've been asked, why are we testing students that have significant cognitive disabilities? Well, it provides data, provides information so that we can advocate for our kids. We can, remember, forensically supported return on investments, AKA data, all right? It gives us that support to say, here, this is what we see. And it helps drive instruction. So I want you to think about this real quick. We look at the problem, we look at the pieces of the problem, we look at what we're doing. Is it working? Let's try something different that worked before somewhere. Implement that, try that, then let's take some data on it. And we keep that problem solving. We keep that wheel going. And so it drives what we do for our students. And we're going to continue to have high expectations for our students with disabilities. It also keeps our schools responsible and accountable. And it gives a complete and accurate picture of how students in the school are doing, including those with disabilities. When students with disabilities are not included in test results, they are excluded from school improvement plans and possibly allocations based on test results. I think of it like this. I go to the doctor and I put one foot on the scale. If I only put one foot on the scale, if I only show you the data for the kids that don't have disabilities, I'm not looking at what I need to do for the students that do have disabilities. We want our schools to be successful with all the learners, okay? You hear of an A school. Is it an A school for all learners? Is it an A school for all the different subgroups that we look at? We want it to be good for everybody. Okay, hello? Okay, implications of instruction in access points. Now remember, access points and alternate academic achievement standards are a change in complexity and can slow the learning opposed to a student that's being taught on general standards. It's different. The complexity is not the same. So we need to start every time we consider how our students are instructed and how they're assessed. We need to consider these things. It's meant for a very small number of students. ESSA says there's a certain percentage of students that should be allowed to take this test, but these students need to be they should have the most significant disabilities. Although life after school seems really far away, taking the alternate assessment instead of the general state assessment can affect your child's graduation, their future education and training, military service, and employment. Yeah. And I'm going to say this as I move through the next slide. As soon as we're done, we need to exit because they have to come in here and do what they have to do. So I'm not pushing you out, but we do have cards if you need. Trisha, do you mind going and standing at the door? And she can hand you a card if you have any comments. Our box will be here in the morning. Please feel free to drop that off. And we'll have a specialist contact you as soon as we get back to the department. And they'll also do a publication. But yes, this can affect graduation, further education, tech schools, military service, and employment. That's why we have to make this consideration. In Florida, we need it to be evident. We need the data to show. We need to know that we tried every single thing that we could to allow this child to be successful in general standards before we say, oh, okay, we're going to go a different route. We're going to do what is most appropriate for that student. And you as an IEP team member are empowered with that. So I can give you superpowers. Get those superpowers. I take them, and yes, I'm going to take them to the IEP team meeting. So these are the 5 things that we should consider. Consider the disability. Is it the most significant cognitive disability? And because they're the only ones that can take this test. If a student doesn't have a most significant cognitive disability, if a student has not been in attendance 70% of the year before, if a student's teacher hasn't been there, we need to go back and let's see what we can do. It needs to be considered every year. Every year, a parent, if the student is going to be instructed on access points, they have to give their consent every year. If that's the decision that the IEP team makes, that parent's consent is required every year. And that we're meeting the guidelines. So we need to stop and think, okay, well, section 300.320 says that we should review and revise. Make sure that this is the most appropriate. So let's say a kid comes from another state or another district and they've been put on access point. The consideration needs to be, hey, are they in the right place? Let's look at the data. Look at the data. Show me the data. That reconsideration, are we doing what's best? Is this kid in the right place? Everybody's in agreement. Super important. What are we looking at? Do we need to do some considerations on some more interventions? We need to make sure that MTSS process keeps going and that problem solving keeps going. And then the instruction. Of course, we want to make sure that those students are in a class where the alignment is with the alternate academic achievement standards, and that they'll be taking the test that aligns with it. Okay? Super important. This is my contact information. Of course, this will be part of the app. I hope you are like Ragu and make sure. Thank you so much. I know it's late. Have a great night, and thank you for being here with me.